Hello, everyone. I'm Anatol Lieven, Director of the Eurasia Programme here at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. It's a great honour today to introduce Professor Sheila Fitzpatrick, a famous social historian of the Soviet Union and Russia, to talk about her latest book, Lost Souls, Soviet Displaced People and the Birth of the Cold War, but also other very famous, in certain circles, would it be fair to say, Sheila, notorious books? Everyday Stalinism, Ordinary Life in Extraordinary Times, Soviet Russia in the 1930s, amongst others, and Tear Off the Masks, Identity and Imposture in 20th Century Russia. Um, I, I hope you'll have questions. If so, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and I will pass them on to Sheila. So, Sheila, welcome. It's great to have you with us.
Lovely to be here.
And could you perhaps just, first of all, introduce your new book, Lost Souls? Tell us about it and why also it is of relevance not just to the start of the Cold War, but also to some things that are going on at present.
Well, the book is about displaced persons, and specifically Soviet displaced persons, along with some Russians who were not Soviet, who sort of joined them in Europe, in camps in Germany after the Second World War. These were people who'd been displaced, either they were forced laborers or they'd been prisoners of war, or else they had left with the Germans quietly at the end of the German occupation during the war. And what I set out to do in the book basically was to look at the whole trajectory. They find themselves displaced. The international refugee organizations put them in camps and put those of them who cannot or won't be repatriated in camps. And then the question is what to do with them. So I more or less track them as a group and through the diplomacy that goes on from the end of the war in Germany to where they ended up. And the great majority of them ended up resettled in outside of Europe. The United States was the biggest recipient. Australia was the next. But there were others whose paths were different. There was a small group that repatriated to the Soviet Union voluntarily. And I particularly, as a historian who loves archives, I particularly value this group because I found a beautiful set of interviews with them on return, where the interviewers had no particular agenda, and the people returning talked about whatever was on their minds, which was usually their personal life. So that was fascinating. Now it turned into what I ended up thinking about this episode was that my displaced persons, or DPs as they were known, that they were an incredibly fortunate group of refugees. It's extremely rare that a refugee problem gets solved. And this one did. It got solved by resettlement in first world countries within 7 years or so. This is, I think, quite extraordinary. And of course, that made me think, why? Why were they so lucky? Because initially they were a group that didn't look so promising. There was the issue of Nazi collaboration for some of them. There were many problems, but somehow all of these were solved. So my question was, why would that be? And the short answer was that a United States Congress voted to pay for their resettlement. But then, of course, you have the question, why did they do that? And the reason is that they'd been successfully redefined. Initially, these displaced persons were seen as victims of war, of the Second World War, and fascism, as it was put on, of the Nazis. But by the time they get resettled, they've been redefined as victims of communism, which is actually the way that they like to see it themselves, for the most part. Victims of communism because they came from countries now communist to which they did not wish to return. And in Cold War circumstances, to have people choosing to live choosing the democratic way, choosing the free world over the totalitarian world. This was a big propaganda gain, and so that's why, in a sense, the Cold War solved their problem. But I'm not only interested in it for that reason, and probably as I was writing it, there were other things that were more on my mind, and one of them was the fact that DPs, who, like other refugees, usually represent themselves, especially in memoirs, as having been pawns of fate, people who could do nothing. The waves of history wash over them and they land on whatever shore. One of the things that impressed me is that there is a lot of agency available to DPs, starting with the fact that they don't want to repatriate and they refuse. And the allies have to give in. That's the first. But individually, there's a huge amount of agency, in part because when you arrive as a refugee, or in this case at any rate, you were not expected to have identity documents. You were who you said you were. Now, that leaves a lot of scope for reinvention, to seek whatever are seen as the needs of the moment, and the DPs certainly took advantage of it.
And also, of course, an old Central and East European story. A good many of them actually were not sure who they were, or at least had a choice of multiple identities, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, DPs, there is some outright fabrication and invention. There's false documents and lots of that going on. But the fact is that a lot of them could say they were different things. If, for example, you were if you came from, let's say, the part of Ukraine that used to be in Poland but was moved to the Soviet Union in 1939, you could identify as Soviet, you could identify as Ukrainian, you could identify as Polish, depending on which you thought would get you the better deal or would save you from peril. They're both things.
And this story also has a personal aspect for you, of course.
Well, it does. I started on it. Well, it's got two personal aspects, really. I started on it after my husband, Michael Darnos, died. That was in 1999. And I was just going through his papers. Now, he was a DP from Latvia, from Riga. He and his mother were both DPs. And very fortunately for me as historian, they lived in almost always, as displaced persons, they lived in different cities, and therefore they wrote to each other. And those letters were kept by Misha's mother. And that was when I read them, that's when I understood about DP agency, because Olga, very practical, his mother, very practical woman, she is all the time writing about, what should we do to maximize our chances of getting where we want to be, having what we want to, achieving what aims we may have. And she was very good at this. And she was also quite articulate about her strategies. And so that really opened my eyes to the question of DP agency. Then the other thing that I think really drew me to displacement was that I displaced myself. Now I'm Australian, but I left to go to graduate school to Oxford when I was in my 20s, and then I went to the United States. So I was, I suppose, a migrant, and I stayed there until 2012 when I went back to Australia, and that experience, all the things that go with going to a place where you have to present yourself again, and you have a choice of exactly who you are, in all kinds of ways. That became personally interesting to me. So that's the other personal part.
Mm. Yes, that is something I appreciate very well myself after my travels. Now, in your book, you bring out another feature, of course, of acceptance and non-acceptance through the interesting case of the Kalmyks.
Oh, yes. Well, the Kalmyks are, this gets us into the question of resettlement and who is going to take DPs. And basically, the International Refugee Organization sort of consulted a lot of countries that might have labor needs and so on, and got them to send selection committees and accept a certain number of the DPs. Now, in the case of Australia, which was the second largest recipient, Australia had a White Australia policy. White Australia, that was basically directed against the Chinese, but it was basically white meant European. Now, the assumption was that the DPs from the Soviet Union and from elsewhere in Europe, they're all European, right? But then if you look more closely at some Soviet DPs, they're not Russian, because it is a multi-ethnic country, but in fact from groups like the Buryats or the Kalmyks, who are of Asian origin, with Mongol roots. So there's the question of, are these people European, and therefore can they be settled? And this, by the way, rather to my surprise, this was an issue with the United States as well, which didn't, after all, have a white America policy.
Well,
But
not
it had
officially.
officially, but it certainly wanted Europeans. Now, the Kalmyks were a group, quite a large and well-organized group among the DPs. They had some units of Kalmyks had collaborated with the Germans, so they had got used to negotiating complex situations. But when it came to being selected for resettlement, there was this problem: are they European or not? And so collectively, they developed a story about it, collectively and individually. Individually, they tended to write that their ancestors had married Russians for generations, which had made them essentially European. But collectively, they also developed a line of argument that said that their values, their democratic values, were such, developed over the centuries for this and that reason, that they were spiritually European too. Now, an argument of this type was put by the IRO lawyer in Washington to the immigration, and incredibly, it prevailed. And so the Kalmyks were omitted. It was decided that they were okay. They were essentially Europeans for the purpose of U.S. immigration.
Because democracy is a universal value of particular importance as the Cold War got underway.
Well, absolutely. This is a Cold War context. So the more that you can, there is a lot of rhetoric on the part of all the DPs about their anti-communism. I think genuinely in most cases, but they certainly knew that this was an important way to present themselves as anti-communist, and of course that means as people whose allegiance is to the free world, is to democracy.
But you do make the point at the end that differential racial attitudes to refugees and migration and displaced people are very much still with us today.
Yes, well, I couldn't help feeling as I looked at my DPs and their enviable whiteness and the success of their resettlement. In the world today, there are a lot of other kinds of stories, right, of refugees who can't be resettled, whose plight seems to be hopeless. But an exception to that in the present world are Ukrainian refugees from the war, who have been welcomed, I think, essentially everywhere, right? And it's hard not to feel that this is because they, not only because they are seen as democratic, but also because they're classified as white, European.
Mm. When it comes to agency, this of course is something that comes out in your other books as well. I mean, individual, family, agency. In writing about Stalinism, sometimes in a good way, you talk about how people, manage to survive through, even at the worst of period of Stalinism. I mean, of course, not everybody, but some people managed to maneuver their way through this system. But of course, when it came to the Great Terror, you also bring out the element of agency, uh, which you see, of course, in under German occupation in various countries as well, that people took advantage of the terror to settle personal scores against relatives, rivals, to advance their careers, or, of course, as so many of the Soviet jokes had it, um, to avoid denunciation themselves by getting their denunciation in first, right?
Right. Well, that does remind us that agency is not always admirable. The way historians and social scientists use it, it's more or less you say somebody's got agency and this has got to be good. But what people do with their agency, in other words, when they act to achieve their goals, is not always that great, as with the denunciation, which was a feature of the Great Purges. Denounce your neighbor, perhaps, if you wanted his apartment, denounce your boss if he's getting on your nerves, and so on. Now, denunciation was also very well known in the DP camps. And on the ships coming out to Australia, the Australians were a little surprised when they found how sort of how organized, not organized, how systematic were the competing denunciations of the post-war migrants coming from Europe that in a boat that would have people from the Baltics and also Jewish migrants, all of them displaced persons. The boats would be denouncing the Jews as communists or sympathizers with the Soviet Union. The Jews would be denouncing the boat as Nazi collaborators, and they would dump all these denunciations would be dumped on the laps of the immigration officers who really didn't know what to do with them. But denunciation isn't the only sort of non-admirable exercise of agency. I mean, just take the involvement in Germany, in the DP camps, the involvement of DPs in the black market. And this was one of the ways of getting on, even potentially becoming rich as a DP. It clearly is an exercise of agency, but not everybody would feel it. It is an admirable exercise. So, and there are of course also lots of exercises of agencies that wouldn't incur moral censure, but it's one should think of it as a broad concept.
Well, I mean, I think that what all this also brings out is something that I fear too many people, and no doubt this is just a human thing, but it does seem particularly strong at present, is this tendency to look into the past and automatically to assume that you would have behaved very, very well. You would never have denounced anybody. Maybe even you would never have engaged in the black market. And there is something childish about this, but there is also something I find often quite unpleasant about it because it makes for this judgment, it extends the judgmentalism of the present, back into the past, often into circumstances that people really cannot actually imagine, really.
Yes. Well,
And
collaboration is another example of that. And collaboration can mean all kinds of things. In this context, we're talking about collaboration with the Germans. There's a kind of collaboration when you volunteered to fight with the Germans because you really embraced their cause. That I think would be quite unusual. But there would be others because you were following your own cause, which was anti-Soviet, and therefore you had
Mhm.
an ally. But you might also volunteer just because if you were in a POW camp and the conditions were bad and you were likely to die and they were recruiting.
Mhm.
So what
Yeah.
do you do? Or alternatively, it's not military, but you're in a place occupied by the Germans and let's say you're a teacher or you're a director of a small enterprise and the Germans say, stay and work with us. Well, do you or don't you? Do you say, no, I don't like you. I won't be a teacher under you? I mean, you
Mhm.
almost certainly don't do that because that would be a sort of suicide. I think collaboration, I think collaboration is a particularly good example of how it's the kind of label term that is always used pejoratively, I think, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it can cover such a multitude of things.
And, there were people, including notably in France, who started off as what would now be called collaborators in, at the very least, working for the Vichy regime and ended up as resistors. So they changed, over time. So,
And in the DP case, it was a bit different, right? I mean, they start off working with German intelligence and go on to work with American and British
mhm,
after the
mm.
war.
Yes, and well, I mean, the Soviet attitude from that point of view, not the Soviets didn't do exactly the same thing themselves. Um, on the one hand, of course, there was um, as you say, much more at the very start than later, but the repression of some of the people who are coming back, the DPs and the POWs. On the other hand, quite a lot of genuine war criminals got quietly covered up by American and British intelligence.
Now, that repatriation, that's an interesting question because the whole group are people who are refusing repatriation, the group that we're talking about. And there'd been sort of massive resistance to it. And what was believed in the DP camps, and I think by the Allies at the time, was that basically everyone who repatriated because of intense Soviet suspicion would be sent to Gulag. So we didn't know, is that the case or not, for a long time. And then the Soviet Union collapsed and the archives opened. And we found quite a surprising picture that actually quite a relatively small proportion of those who went back, including those who went back, who were forced to repatriate, actually were sent to Gulag. There was a filtration process, and about 7% is what it looks like. And about half were just sent home. And then the rest of them were not sent to Gulag, but they were sent somewhere to labor battalions back into the army and so on. Now, those figures are partially explained by the fact that DPs were both male and female. The male rate of both collaborating and serving in armed forces under Germans and being sent to Gulag, much, much higher, of course. For women, there was very little risk, as a matter of fact, in repatriating the. Now, that doesn't mean that you necessarily had a very happy life when you got back, because neighbors, there's a lot of, especially if you come back with a child, which many of them did, and so is this a child of a German, and so you really want to have a cover story for your neighbors, and you may conceivably run into problems with the police, but I think neighbors above all. But the thing is, it's a very different situation for repatriating women and repatriating men.
Yes, I mean, I find even, well, not when I was growing up, but it's become more or less one of these accepted beliefs that the experience of the Cossack units in the German army, which apparently was very bad. They a lot of them genuinely were shot or sent straight off to the camps. That was, characteristic of the response to all the DPs, which,
Yes,
as you say, it
and of
clearly
course that
wasn't.
comes early.
Mm.
That uh, it's not that there was no repression of them. It's simply that as it turns out, the assumption that everyone who went back, regardless of what they had done, was likely to end up in Gulag. That one turns out not to have been true. But of course, now the other thing we should say about repatriation, the Soviets handled it so badly in as it were publicity terms, because the DPs with Soviet citizenship, quite a large proportion, we don't know exactly how large because everyone's lying about who they are, but probably maybe 40%, come in fact from those areas that had been incorporated in the Soviet Union only in 1939-40. by the terms of the Nazi-Soviet pact. That means people from the Baltic, people from the formerly Polish, the part of Ukraine that was formerly in Poland and Belarus. Now, those people they were given Soviet citizenship. They had no choice about it. But they don't see themselves as Soviet citizens in the way that people who, were real Soviet citizens do. They, in many cases, see themselves as under a Soviet occupation. So it's extremely clear that it's not at all surprising that they don't want to go back in large numbers. Now, the Soviets this, of course, gave the impression that nobody wants to go back to the Soviet Union, which I think was an erroneous impression as far as the old Soviets were concerned. But since the Soviet Union would never make any distinction between the two, they were very insistent that all their citizens should be returned, that they owned their citizens. That's why I call it lost souls, because the soul was a unit of property under serfdom. So they owned their citizens, and they all ought to go back. But in fact, there's an extremely large difference in the situation of old Soviet citizens and new forcibly incorporated Soviet citizens with regard to repatriation.
It's something. So this is a very broad question, but of course, in the background to your book, and which also does talk about this, there is the complete breakdown of understanding, and not just of understanding, of course, of actions that led to the Cold War. Sorry, this is a very big question, but do you see this as inevitable, given the difference, the profound difference of the systems, or was there a chance to do things differently?
The Cold War.
Mm.
Well, look, I mean, you look at the war, and you'd have to say cooperation is possible, right? Because during the war, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union did cooperate really surprisingly well, and this falls apart. And I mean, I don't want to jump into a very controversial field, but it is the big issue is Eastern Europe, where the Soviets see a necessity to create a buffer zone to protect themselves from any further attacks from the West. And the West sees this as communist imperialism on the march, and it's gone to Eastern Europe, and it'll go to Western Europe, and it'll go to the rest of the world. There's clearly a big misunderstanding, a big gap between the understanding of the situation, post-war situation in Eastern Europe. So could that have been finessed? I mean, I suppose I probably think it could have, but it would have been hard and not very likely. And in general, I rather resist the notion that things were inevitable. That the only one outcome, the outcome that we know happened, it had to happen. I mean, there is the danger of being led into a circular kind of thing there. It happened, and therefore it had to happen. The Soviets were, the Soviets behaved in a very difficult way for the West to deal with. America, on the other hand, it's hard not to use terms like hysteria, anti-communist hysteria for the attitudes that developed by about 1947. Much stronger, much more violent, really, than any on the Soviet side, which is a curious thing. So it would have been hard. You would have had to, on the Western side, I think you would have had to have had leaders who were essentially going against the popular will, probably. But that happens, could have happened,
I mean,
but
my
not
own
very
sense for
likely.
my own sense for what it's worth is that a military buffer zone would have actually had considerable sympathy and acceptance in the West, but of course the extension of the communist system,
Right.
which for the Soviet leadership was more or less one and the same thing in terms of security, was, almost by definition unacceptable. As on the other hand, Well, in the 1990s, um, the Russians withdrew. Well, first the Soviets, obviously under Gorbachev, and then the Russians withdrew their forces. And then, from their point of view, the next thing they got, and allowed, Western systems to be established. And the next thing they got, of course, was Western troops on their border. So,
Well, that is another. It's a similar case, isn't it? Where the assumptions on the Western and the Russian or Soviet assumptions about the significance are of something are so much at odds, and there is so very little understanding. And one might even say there's very little wish to understand, perhaps how the other side is thinking.
I mean, something that I think comes out very much from your work, but unfortunately in a negative way from some of the criticisms of it, is something that I always felt as a journalist, but with a historical training in the countries where I worked. I was very interested in the lives of ordinary people and their social patterns, their behavior, how they operated in certain circumstances. And I've always been, and it seems to be getting worse, that so many people in the West whose, you could say, whose job it is or would have been to look at this kind of thing about other societies are now profoundly uninterested. And I mean, in the case of the Soviet Union, there was also the ideological element because, of course, this had to be portrayed as a constant, unchanging totalitarianism, imposed from above, in which nobody had any, agency or free, or couldn't even lead what we would regard as a normal life. But I find more generally as well that we don't seem terribly curious about other
No,
societies
the
and
funny thing,
cultures.
I gave a talk last week on a completely different subject on the end of Sovietology when the Cold War parameters disappeared and the Soviet Union collapsed. And I ended up saying, expressing almost a nostalgia for the good old days of the Cold War, because in the Cold War, Soviet studies was valued as knowing your enemy. It was necessary to know
Mhm.
your enemy. Uh, but now it isn't. I mean, now we have a very strongly hostile attitude to Russia, but it's not considered necessary to know anything
Mm.
about
Which is odd, right?
it.
Isn't it strange?
Uh, uh, I suppose it is strange, I suppose, because it involves this rather contradictory set of postulates. On the one hand, Russia is very bad, and Putin is Stalin, and so on. So they're extremely bad, but at the same time, they're completely insignificant. I
Yeah.
mean, just a regional power. So these two things sort of work together, evidently, to say let's not bother about finding out too much about them.
But on the third hand, if such a thing exists, um, if they're not, stopped in eastern Ukraine, they will threaten to invade NATO and Western Europe. So they're simultaneously evil, insignificant and unimportant, and enormously threatening and dangerous. I mean, it's interesting that, in my naive youth, I might have said that you needed something like, well, I don't know whether a totalitarian system, but certainly something like a religious system to keep ideas as contradictory as this all in your head at the same time. But it seems that this is entirely possible in a democracy as well, if we are
Oh
a
yeah, I think we can keep contradictory ideas in our head without any difficulty.
as human beings, actually.
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, totally agree. Um, Well, some questions, but first, a personal message from Ambassador Bob Hunter, who says, "Hi Sheila, I recall our adventure in Moscow in 1966, when you rescued our student trip that I led from London to Moscow and on to Tokyo. Best regards, Bob Hunter." It sounds as if there's a good anecdote in there somewhere.
Oh yes, yeah, we were on this cheap, cheap trip, Sputnik, I think it was. We run run out of Britain uh, via the Czechs. In other words, we paid a cut rate to the Czechs, and when we got to the Soviet Union, they they decided that they were sick of this, financial trickery, and which of course we were not involved in. It was just the agency we'd booked it, and so they sort of stranded us. They took us out to a boarding school, internat, and yeah, and there we struggled. Yes, and the two of us, I was the only one with any Russian, and it wasn't that great either. And anyway, we went and made the argument. And somebody, as I remember, somebody in the British Embassy finally helped us sort it out. And we continued on our way. We were not sent back.
Mm. A question about the particular experience of Jewish displaced people after the war.
Yes. Now, this is fascinating, actually, because there are about, it's maybe 20%, maybe more, varies at different times, of the displaced people, persons are Jewish, and the rest are non-Jewish, Slavic, usually from Eastern Europe. But it's the Jewish DPs that are the most prominent in people's imagine or knowledge of the insofar as people are aware of this episode. And there's a bit of a conflation of the two groups, which I think sometimes is quite misleading because they really were pretty different. Now, the Jewish group, which of course doesn't want to be repatriated to its countries of origin, which include Germany, are set on going to Palestine shortly to become Israel, and which they ultimately are able to do, although there's problems because the British are dragging their feet. That's interesting because the Americans are pushing the British, and so are the Soviets. The Americans and Soviets on this issue are in alignment, though they never like to say so. So that's the Jewish situation. And the Jewish DPs are in separate camps. In general, the camps was emerged as sort of national based, but in particular, they're in separate camps because they absolutely refused to be with other DPs because they had an intense hostility to, in particular, the Poles and others that they saw as part of the, among their tormentors. The non-Jewish DPs are characterized by quite a strong nationalism and a very strong anti-communism, which is more or less irrelevant to the Jewish DPs. They are not focused on being anti-communist, or that doesn't matter to them. But it really characterizes the other lot. And there is hostility between the two groups. I mean, I mentioned the denunciations on the boats going to Australia. That's an illustration of that, and it's carried into the diaspora. And when the war, there are among the resettled DPs, there are quite a few sought by the Soviet Union as war criminals, sought with evidence that they had gathered. And the Soviets in the 60s would ask for the extradition of these people who'd been settled in the US or Canada or Australia, and those countries would all refuse to return them. But if you remember, in the 80s, things change around a bit, and the US leads the way in starting to go after war criminals who had, basically in the US, the way they go after them is that they entered the country concealing this aspect of their past, and therefore they were illegal immigrants. So, and that same revival of, or rather for the first time, going after war criminals among the post-war migrants that is mirrored in all the other countries of resettlement. And in those countries, great hostility and Jewish migrants, Jewish former migrants in the who are living in the same places, are of course prominent among those who want justice with regard to war criminals. So the antagonisms back in the DP camps are replayed in the diaspora in the 1980s and early 90s.
And even today, to an extent, though people are now
Well,
very,
they
very
stopped
old.
trying to prosecute war criminals.
Yeah.
I mean, these war criminals were, now they were all dead.
Yeah.
They were, of course, almost all dead at the time, but
Yeah.
then too.
But I suppose the point being that from the 1980s, under pressure, Western authorities began to prosecute people themselves, but they were still not sending people back, sending people to the Soviet Union where they had committed their crimes to be prosecuted.
No, there was the odd case actually, but still they were cooperating with the Soviet authorities and accepting the prosecutors, the US ones and the Australian ones too. After a while, they were accepting that the evidence that the Soviets presented was not just fabricated. But there was a lot of pushback from that. In Australia, the only cases brought all failed because the courts wouldn't accept that premise, that evidence that came from the Soviet Union was usable.
Another question, to what extent during the Cold War and even now can these displaced people inform but also skew our understanding of the countries from which they came?
Yes, they can clearly do both, can't they? Because on the one hand, in order to get yourself selected for resettlement, you had to present yourself in certain ways. You had to be healthy, first of all. You didn't want to have, if you had a family back home, forget about that. And then you had to be anti-communist. You had to explain that your reason for not returning was because you couldn't stand, you hated communism and you loved democracy. You do that's a given that you have to make that statement. Wait a minute, give me a question again because I've lost where I was going.
Well, two questions actually along the same lines. I mean, how the experience and the views of the DPs
Right.
shaped
Yes.
Western understandings of the countries from which they came, and was this a wholly good thing?
So on the one hand, the DPs migrating to the US and Australia and Canada and so on, they offer themselves as witnesses to the evils of communism. That's an easy way in a Cold War circumstance. That's an easy way to find find a role. So that's one kind of information that they give, which may or may not be reliable. I should say that almost all DP families acquire a grandfather who was sent to Gulag, which that may be, and they also acquire noble ancestors.
Well, I was about to say that on a more light-hearted note.
No,
When
it's
it comes
true.
to
It's true. There's and many of them even connected with the royal family. But
Mhm.
anyway, not to go down
especially
that
of
byway.
course,
There's
when
also
introducing themselves to girls.
yeah. The other thing, and this is the DPs were it was the DP population from which were drawn the interviewees for the Harvard project on the Soviet social system just after in the late 40s, financed by the RAND Corporation, and certainly it can be seen as a Cold War enterprise. And it was not only done with DPs, but done with DPs who were in part collected. They sort of recruited for the interviews by members of very strongly anti-Soviet organizations, and the people who signed up had a probably misplaced hope that if you participate in these interviews, that would improve your chances of getting to the United States. Despite all those apparent disadvantages that should have made the Harvard Interview Project a worthless source of information, I actually think it's a really good source of information. This was an interdisciplinary social science group that really devised its. They didn't want to know about the DP's political activities or anything about their DP status. Currently, they just wanted to use them as informants about how the Soviet system worked. And I think they managed to get an extraordinary amount of useful stuff out of them, which is all the more remarkable because of the the rather dubious way in which the group was gathered.
Several questions actually about today, and those Russians, well, of course, also Ukrainians, and for some of the same reasons, in many cases to avoid military service, as far as young men are concerned, who have fled their countries since the invasion of Ukraine. I mean, what parallels and differences do you see to the DPs after the Second World War? And actually, if I could introduce a question of my own, I mean, should we? I mean, in a way, nobody seems to be really thinking of doing this systematically, perhaps because, now, well, we think that Russia is open and that Ukraine is open and that we don't need to do a Harvard-like project. But of course, in many ways, it isn't open. Well, Russia is not open to us, or at least, we to some extent have withdrawn from it. And in Ukraine, there are quite severe inhibitions in certain cases to sort of talking about things. I mean, are there parallels, and is there a case for something like the Harvard Project to talk to people from these places about, their lives, their real experiences, their real views?
I wonder, because, when the Soviet Union before the war really was cut off from the West, and of course after the war too, to a large extent, though diminishing, it really and truly was cut off. And therefore, when the Harvard Project people are trying to find out about, they're trying to find out about because really what is known is from reading Pravda, which doesn't give you the the proper the Soviet Party newspaper. So there really was a point in, and what the Soviets, of course, published a lot about themselves, but in a self-congratulatory and propagandistic way. Therefore, what was known about the way people actually lived was very small. But I wouldn't have thought that is the case with Ukraine. I mean, for the years leading up to the war, I mean, it was a society open to our gaze. Perhaps we didn't gaze as much as we should have, but so I would. If I were a funding agency and somebody said, let's do a big funding project based on the Ukrainian emigres, I might be a bit doubtful about how much that would be used. Now, with regard to the Russians, there's the interesting question about which I really can't give an answer to, but it used to be that when in Soviet times, that when somebody left the Soviet Union, they were gone. They were emigres. There was no way back for them, except in the rarest of circumstances. It was an existential choice, and once you were out, you forfeited your status as a Soviet citizen. That seems to me is not exactly the case at the moment. There appears to me to be much more movement both ways across the borders than we actually acknowledge. If you leave Russia now, including because you're opposed to the war, as far as I can see, that doesn't bar your way back at some later point in the same way. And
Not,
so
I mean,
borders mean really something different than they did in Soviet times.
yes. I mean, Unless you have basically come out in public against the war while in the West, come out strongly and not just against the war, because I was told that, people who had come out against the war would be, after the war, whenever that is, would be forgiven and allowed back, probably. People who had sort of explicitly supported the opposition, the Russian opposition against the war in the West. That would be a different matter. But I mean, as far as just, ordinary Russians who left, or for that matter, of course, who've been living in the West for many, many years, and then, have gone back again, either because they're no longer afraid of conscription or because, they're the West has become, in certain respects, an uncomfortable place for them. There's no barrier to them at all. I
The
think.
barrier is I mean, the real new barrier is to us, right? The people,
Yeah.
Westerners who study the Soviet Union, who essentially can't go back at the moment. And that it's not clear whether Russia would forbid us going back, but it's certainly clear that Western funding agencies, universities, and so on, there is a very and within the profession a very strong feeling that nobody should go to Russia.
Which is once again so weird because, my father, was head of the BBC Russian service, but he was also a former British intelligence officer. But until Czechoslovakia, he traveled to the Soviet Union, and was encouraged to do so, by everyone, as far as I know, in the British establishment, in order to, try and find out what the hell was going on there.
Well, these were
Um,
the good old days of know your enemy. Know
well,
your
precisely.
enemy.
Yeah. No, I mean, and then when he denounced the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, of course, they barred him from going into the Soviet Union. But that was the Soviet Union doing it, not us. We wanted people to go there to
Yes,
find out.
yes, that's the odd sort of discrepancy. There used to be the government exchanges by which researchers went, and I went in 1968. It wasn't the British exchange was not broken off when the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia, though everybody strongly disapproved. But there wasn't the feeling that you had to stop the exchange because of it. Same thing with Afghanistan in '79 wasn't broken off. So it's a funny shift in the Western attitude, which I don't fully know how to explain.
Mm. But do you see this as coming down from the Cold War in some ways? Because reading some of the critiques of your books written, while the Cold War was going on, I do detect a certain air of, it is actually wrong and bad to try to understand this society, because this society is simply evil, and that's all we need to know about it. I mean, is that a tradition which lingers?
Yes, uh, uh, who knows? I mean, I think there's got to be some relationship, but I do think, despite all that, certainly when some of the things I wrote about when I was trying to understand how Soviet society worked, that bothered people in the US, in part because you look at society and by definition you're looking at something that happens below, whereas the reigning understanding was everything comes from above. So what can there to be to look at from below? But even in those days, uh, there was a feeling that you need to, perhaps you don't want to find out what happens below, but you certainly want to find out what's happened on top.
Hmm.
Remember all the Kremlinology? Always very hard to pronounce that word. And that was the characteristic of the Cold War, that it is the enemy, but we need to know it.
Hmm. Yes. Well, I always remember that there was bitter, I think, congressional criticism and even an attempt, I believe, to censor a book of world peoples in the 1950s because, it had pictures of smiling, Indians, um, and so it also had pictures of smiling Soviet citizens, and this was illegitimate because you did not smile in the Soviet Union. You couldn't, you know, things
Of
were
course,
so.
one has to say that compared to Americans, they didn't smile. I mean, in other words, don't you remember? Of course, your friends smiled at you, but on the street, there was much
Oh,
less of a smiling culture.
I mean, I still remember. I still remember the first time. You know, and this was already deep into perestroika, when a shop assistant smiled at me in the Soviet Union. And I sort of you felt like looking over your shoulder to see if you know there was a friend of hers behind you. You know what? So this is weird. This is unnatural. You know,
Yes.
maybe she's about to bite me, which would seem to come much more naturally to Soviet shop assistants. So
Yes.
yes, I mean, as so often, you know, so many prejudices do have a certain basis in truth, and of course, I don't think that anybody, anywhere, above all from the Soviet Union itself, would have wished to defend or justify the Soviet service industries, right?
I haven't seen any move towards it.
No, no, that would
Certainly
be
isn't coming from me.
yeah, that would be one rehabilitation too far. I think, you know, although who knows, you know, who knows? Give it 100 years or so, and if we're all still here, and if there are any historians, no doubt there will be a revisionist school of history after, of course, all the participants are long safely dead, which will say that you know actually the Soviet service industry and shops and things worked very well, and this was all wicked propaganda. So,
That's a bit of a mean thing to end with.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I couldn't resist that. But well, Sheila, thank you so much. And thanks to the audience. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all your questions. It's been a pleasure, and I urge everybody to get, sorry, it's back to front, of course, but this fascinating book, Lost Souls. Thank
Thank
you.
you.